Okay. So last time we saw the background on daimonis, on spirits, before we went into Plotinus's treatise on our allotted spirit, and today that's what we're going to do. But of course, there's specific background to what he does in the first two chapters. So it's interesting that like Plotinus, he doesn't dive directly into the question of the daimon. He actually starts with two chapters on the soul, because he first wants to establish that soul is what gives life to everything and that constitutes everything in the world. And then he's going to ask, well, then how does soul also, in some sense, create or become a god or a daimon? But so the first two chapters are about how does the soul uh, become everything and even plants. So let me give you some background about that. Mm. So, right, so this is going to be about chapters one and two. It's about how the soul cares for all things. Now, this idea the soul cares for all things, manages all things, or something that comes from the Phaedrus, right? It comes from it's the very beginning of the text on of the allegory of the soul as a winged chariot, and he goes on to say, now I should try to tell you why living things are said to include both mortal and immortal beings. All soul looks after all that lacks a soul, and patrols all of heaven, taking different shapes at different times. So long as its wings are in perfect condition, it flies high, and the entire universe is its dominion. But a soul that sheds its wings wanders until it lights on something solid where it settles and takes on an earthly body, which then, owing to the power of this soul, seems to move itself. The whole combination of soul and body is called a living thing or animal, and has the designation mortal as well. Such a combination cannot be immortal, not on any reasonable account. So, here are a couple of things that are important for Plotinus. The first is all soul looks after all that lacks a soul. This expression "all soul" is famously ambiguous, hasa psyche, because it could mean, like in the English, all soul could mean the whole soul, right? It could also mean every soul. And heaven is an ambiguous expression. Uranos is an ambiguous expression, as Plato mentions in the Timaeus. You can use Uranos to mean just the heavens. You can use it to mean the whole world as well. And so this could mean that it goes around the heavens, or also that it goes in through the whole world, both above and below. If here below, taking different shapes at different times, you could interpret that as about transmigration. It becomes different things, right? And and there's a reference to incarnation right after this. And so like this is like a where Plotinus and in general Platonus is the prime text for them for the importance of soul in explaining all kinds of change. And however, here he applies it to everything in the world. And uh, Plotinus will start his text talking even about how soul creates plants. And he thinks that the soul in plants is the most, is the best example of of the soul taking care of something that entirely lacks soul. Because what plants generates, or what the power of growth in a plant generates, is not itself another living thing. And so it's as it were, the end of the hierarchy. There, the soul is directly taking care of matter, right? Just the pure possibility of to receive a form. And in seeing Soul go all the way to down to plants, Plotinus is harking back perhaps all the way back to Empedocles, right? So Empedocles, there are these two passages, fragments conserved of his, that David Sedley has argued came at the beginning of his two books, right? So he had one book which was on on natural and like his natural philosophy, and he had another book called Purifications. And at the beginning of the one on natural philosophy, according to Sedley's argument, was this passage where it has many resonances with what we're seeing, also because of Empedocles' Pythagorean background, right? So the importance of transmigration for him. And so he says, there is a decree of necessity, an ancient resolution of the gods, sworn by broad oaths, that when one of the daimons which have a share of long life defiles its own limbs or does wrong, swears a false oath, for 30,000 years it must wander away from the Blessed Ones, being born during that time as every form of mortal creature, exchanging for each other the arduous paths of life. The might of the ethers drives it to the sea spits it out into the threshold of land, the fire sends it into the rays of the gleaming sun, the sun hurls it into the whirling ether. One receives it from another, and all hate it. I too am now one of these, a fugitive from the gods and a wanderer who trusts in raving strife. So here, what's interesting for us is not just that there's this very plastic description of transmigration, where he's going from element to element and going through all the different elements, so also like the heavens and also the earth, but also this idea that he himself is a daimon that's um, moving down here and in his transmigrations. And that's recalls these ideas about like to what degree is our daimon is distinct from human souls? Isn't is maybe talking about the human reason as a daimon actually a way of making it, as it were, seem more separate, more alien to us than it usually is, right? And this opening contrasts with the opening of the text on purifications, which was, about we think was mainly about, how to purify yourself in order to have a better next transmigration. And there he doesn't present himself as this damned daimon. On the contrary, he presents himself as a god. He says, friends who in the great town of the yellow Acragus dwell in the city's heights, carrying out good deeds, I greet you. You see me going about as a divine god, no longer immortal, honored amongst all, it seems, and wreathed in ribbons and verdant garlands. Right. So um, here, this also, so Empedocles, he also incorporates this possibility of becoming divine, which was a question that we had. Seems like in Plotinus's life, at the end of his life, he became um, some kind of daimon, went to join Plato and Pythagoras and others. And with regard to the transmigrations, Empedocles was someone who explicitly talked about transmigration into plants, right? So among beasts, they are born as lions with lairs in the hills and beds on the ground, and as laurels among fair tressed trees, right? But at the end, they come among men on earth as prophets, bards, doctors, and princes, and thence they arise as gods, highest in honor, sharing with the other immortals their hearth and their table, without part in human sorrows or weariness. So here we have this whole extension from plants all the way to gods through transmigration. Now, of course, there's also Platonic background, and transmigration to beasts shows up in the myth of as well, where interestingly enough, it's not purely free choice that guides people, but rather free choice molded by character. So after he describes Odysseus's choice, he says, um, still other souls change from animals into human beings, or from one kind of animal into another, with unjust people changing into wild animals and just people into tame ones, and all sorts of mixtures occurred. So there is in the choice of life in the myth of Earth still this principle that, vice leads to a worse kind of animal, virtue to a different kind of animal. And of course, it also tells you the myth in other places tells about people choosing human lives, right? So here, Odysseus chose the life of a private individual. Um, in the Timaeus, it figures at the end, right? At the end, we get this description about rebirth that's problematic, um, not only for the idea of association of animals with unjust lives, but also with women with cowardice, right? But so at the end, you get this account of transmigration, but this corresponds to something in the middle, right? This corresponds to when the demiurge gives over to the younger gods, the junior gods, the task of creating the other living beings, which we saw figured prominently in Proclus's interpretation of Homer. And there remain still three kinds of mortal beings that have not yet been begotten. And as long as they have not come to be, the universe will be incomplete. For it will still lack within it all the kinds of living things it must have if it is to be sufficiently complete. So here there we see like the cosmological function of the soul in the words of the Phaedrus of taking different shapes and at different times, right, and becoming all the different kinds of things. Um, and the Timaeus also discusses plants, and it makes a point that they can be called zoa, because you could this word can often be used to only apply to animals, right? And so he talked about how it was created for like the younger gods create the plants for the sake of feeding humans, and um, and then he says, we may call these plants living things, though on the ground that anything that partakes of life has an incontestable right to be called a living thing. And in fact, what we are talking about now partakes of the third type of soul, the type that our account is situated between the midriff and the navel. This type is totally devoid of opinion, reasoning, or understanding, though it does share in sensation, pleasant and painful, and desires. For throughout its existence, it is completely passive. Its formation is not entrusted with the natural ability to discern and reflect upon any of its own characteristics by revolving within and about itself, repelling movement from without and exercising its own inherent movement. Hence, it is alive, to be sure, an unmistakably living thing, but it stays put, standing fixed and rooted since it lacks self-motion. So you see there he has to make this point about that it's a living thing because some people say no, that word is just for animals. And furthermore, we see a connection here between he introduces in the explanation that this other kind of living thing, it has just one part of what we have, right? It has this third type of soul that's between the midriff and the navel. And this is the soul that's responsible just for our growth, right? And that's because that's all plants do. They absorb nutrients and they grow and produce fruit and seed. So that's although in the Timaeus there's no connection between plant and transmigration, there is a connection between them and the earth. And Plotinus does generate this idea that the soul of the earth as a god generates the souls of plants, which are then like their power of production. And in 3.8 in his treatise on contemplation, he says, since the form of the plant is, as it were, an imitation of the universal form of the forms in nous, you can say that that plants in some sense contemplate. That's a kind of contemplation, their reproduction and growth of themselves. In the Phaedo, he connects transmigration with the theme of pollution and purity that we saw before. Right? So we saw this previously, this idea that if you have an impure body, your soul is heavy and goes down to Hades and haunts your grave. But then he adds the idea that we saw in the myth of Ur as well, that if according to your character, you end up being reborn as a different kind of animal, right? So, um, those who practice gluttony, violence, and drunkenness are likely to join a company of donkeys. And he says, tyranny and plunder become wolves, and hawks and kites, they become predators. Those which have, those have popular and social virtue, right? So, um, the merely political virtues and that aren't even self-reflected, they become, social animals like bees or wasps or ants. And then finally, there's uh, the Phaedo also holds out this prospect of joining the company of the gods. No one may join the company of the gods who has not practiced philosophy and is not completely pure when he departs from life. No one but the lover of learning. Right. So that's and so that's the background of transmigration in the Taimi, in the Phaedo, and you see how that means that the Phaedo, this connects it we saw both this moral component to the doctrine, where bad character and pollution, being impurity determines your rebirth. But we also saw in the Phaedrus and the Timaeus this cosmological function, and we saw even if there's not a direct connection to transmigration and plants like there is in Empedocles, there is this idea that they do have some kind of soul clearly in the Timaeus. Um, so that's the background for these two things. So why don't we now jump into reading, unless you have some question. We just
No, no, the only question, I mean, I don't have a question, but all of these, or almost all of these sources, especially like Empedocles, is something like seems to make this thing called soul, and it depersonalizes it, if that makes sense. Like it turns out that this is just like, I mean, maybe that's the point of transmigration, but it turns out that this is like one like movement in the universe or
yeah.
life, but there isn't, it's not it you we stop talking about like human beings or about even like specific animals or specific lives like biographies. It's just like I mean water turns into fire and souls is in charge of all kinds of turning into, and it's like some kind of, I don't know, it doesn't have the like the personal or maybe the moral connotation in the way that we usually talk about soul, even here.
Yeah, so I think
Uh,
this is for Neoplatonists, that's an important feature about their talk about soul, about psyche. It's one of the reasons why, I mean, I'm using soul here because we're using translations that use soul, but nowadays I prefer when I have to translate something myself to use something like life for psyche in the Neoplatonist texts because it really is depersonalized and I think for the Neoplatonists, that's this kind of depersonalization is a moral achievement, right? When you understand yourself no longer as this biographical individual, but as this soul, this psyche that's lived countless lives and that will live another countless lives. That's, you're understanding yourself better. And and I think there's also, there's a question here about it makes some things more difficult to understand. So, for instance, we understand what it is to make a choice, or we have a reference for that. And so, we there are certain constraints, and then we have to pick between two things, and we pick within our biography, right? Our narrative. What do we want, or where we come from? And when the myth of Ur talks about souls choosing, it it can't be exactly the same kind of choice as ours, right? Because there seems to be fewer of those biographical constraints, and especially, if you think that the better souls are those that are more pure, and so that understand better that they are separate from this particular life, then for them the choices are, even less biographical and more open. And so like talking about the soul, oh, your soul chose to become you before you were born, that can only be some kind of metaphor, even if you're not saying that, oh, like the soul never, because there's one way of saying that's a metaphor by saying like, oh, that's just a metaphor for how important our choices during our life are. No, this is it can you can think no, like the physical theory is supposed to be true. You know, these souls really did exist and were active before we were born. And but the idea that they somehow choose, there has to be something analogical in that. It's not going to be a choice the same that we choose. But yeah, I think that's an important feature of Platonist talk uh, about soul, that it is less personal than the like contemporary uh, discourses.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, okay, but let's dive into Plotinus then. Okay, background. Mhm. Right there.
Okay.
Okay, okay. So, do you want to start reading 341?
3, 4. Let me find it.
Okay.
Our we call it our tutelary spirit. That's what.
Yes, that's it the um uh, in the McKenna.
Okay,
Yeah.
so okay. Now, some exist. Number one, some existence, absolute unity and intellectual principle, remain at rest. Remain at rest while their hypostasis or expressed ideas come into being, meaning they create without moving, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but in our view, the soul generates by its motion, generates the sensitive faculty, considered as expression form, what it means, and the faculty of growth, in which soul extends to the vegetable order.
Right. So this expression form, um, that's I'm not exactly sure why McKenna is translated in this way, but here it means in the Greek it says ten en hypostase. So as something really as something that exists, right? Not just as a power, but as something that exists in something else, I guess. And so here in the uh, Gerson edition, it when it generates this faculty of sense perception, which is itself a real existent. Um, so so it produces something else. That's the idea.
Okay.
And this faculty of growth, I mean, it is the power by which things grow, and and in Greek that's physis, nature.
Mhm. Right. And the faculty of growth, in which, okay, the soul's, even as it is present in human beings, the soul carries this faculty of growth with it. But it is not the dominant, since it is not the whole man. In the vegetable order, what we call the nutritive soul, right? In the vegetable order is the highest, since there's nothing to rival it. But at this phase, it is no longer reproductive, or at least when it produces, what it produces is of quite another order. Here, life ceases, all later production is lifeless. What is the later production? Meaning there's nothing lower than
Yeah,
vegetables, lower than.
yeah. There's nothing lower, or there's nothing living lower than vegetables, lower than plants. Um, I mean, yeah. Uh, all the things, we nowadays recognize a bunch of other living beings that are simpler than plants, but I think from a Neoplatonist point of view, these would all just be plants because they're all they just absorb nutrients and reproduce themselves. Right.
Hmm.
So from so like bacteria and fungi, things like that. Of course, our picture of some of these things, like fungi and also plants, are much more complicated, and some people nowadays want to talk about the cognitive life of plants and things like that. But um, and there's some room for that in 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 the Platonic picture, because they do have room, for instance, for recognizing that a, a sunflower turns with the sun, right? Or that a plant grows in the direction where there's more sun, right? Because the idea there is that the nutritive soul grows in the direction of where there's food, right? Of where. So that's thing, but I don't know the details of contemporary research to know to what degree it poses problems. And of course, I mean, contemporary biology poses a number of problems for Platonists, not least is the fact that species go extinct.
Hmm.
Um, but But yeah, and so here you see him already introducing this idea. So we saw this idea in the Timaeus already that the nutritive or vegetable soul, plant soul is also in the human being, but in the human being it's just a part. Whereas in plants it's the whole thing, or if it's not the whole thing, it is the highest, right? It's the most important thing. So this idea that soul gives life to each thing, and it gives the kind of life that is dominant in it, right? So if the power to grow is dominant in it, it's a plant. If the power, say, to perceive is dominant in it, it's an animal. If the power to know is dominant in it, it's a human being, right? And uh, and after the plant, there's nothing else that's generated.
And is the point that like the plant is generated by the animal, or there's like some connection in this whole chain? Like,
There is some connection in this chain. It's not clear what it is. I mean, as I mentioned, one possibility for one kind of Platonist would be that if you live a bad life and you become an animal, and then you live a life as an animal where the sole concern is, as it were, eating and sleeping and growing, then you might end up becoming a plant because, the vegetative thing was the most important thing in this life, and so it will choose to be a plant. That's if you have transmigration to plants like you have in Empedocles. In the Timaeus, there is a connection between plants and animals, but it's not that one. It's a teleological one, right? Where plants are created for the sake of feeding and replenishing animal bodies that are constantly wasting away and being undone. So that would be a different way. That would be like a teleological way. And of course, teleology often gets reversed into production in Neoplatonism, and that to which a thing turns back is also where it comes from. And in Plotinus, as I mentioned, it seems that the soul of the earth gives rise to um, the souls of plants, and the soul of the earth has, it's a god. The earth is a god, a goddess, so it has all, rational and perceptive capacities. Another way in which animal souls are responsible and for vegetable ones is also that the plant soul is the power that grows the body. But it grows the body as having these limbs and having these organs because these organs have to serve the animal soul for perception, right? And so in that sense, the teleology um, of the animal capacity determines the nutritive and growth capacity as well. So those are a few ways. Plotinus is being vague here. He doesn't really explain what he's thinking, But yeah, there's you. I think you are right to see that there's some kind of step-by-step thing.
Okay. But this, okay. What does this imply? Everything the soul engenders down to this point, so down to this point of sheer lifelessness, comes into being shapeless and takes form by orientation towards its author and supporter. Therefore, and even more certainly, the thing engendered on the furthest side can be no image of the soul, since it is not even alive. It must be an utter indetermination.
Right. Um, let's pause here. So utter indetermination. So that's, something that has no determinate form of its own, just has a capacity to receive form. So this is a way of Plotinus referring to, as it were, prime matter, right? And so here you have an idea that the soul, in some sense, produces matter as the last thing in the hierarchy. But it's but he says that it's this is also what's true previously. So actually, in the Greek, it doesn't say everything the soul engenders down to this point, but rather just everything that comes to be up to this point. Um, uh, right, everything that is engendered. So um, just as everything that was generated before this was generated without form, but received form, or was generated without shape, but received form by turning to to its generator and its nourisher, right? Its author and supporter. Just so, right? The thing engendered on what he says about soul. So, and here, this is a particularly Plotinian way of thinking about procession, right? So, where he thinks that procession is, as it were, two-phased. At first, there's so the cause remains as it is. And being what it is, it has a secondary activity, right? So, like fire warming and sun shining. And this secondary activity is at first um, shapeless, right? Indeterminate. But then it turns towards its cause and it becomes what it is. So unity, its secondary activity is this indefinite, intelligible matter that when it turns, that however, intrinsically turns towards unity, and in turning towards unity becomes nous. Nous produces this indeterminate, say, um, uh, this second intelligible matter, like an indeterminate vitality that when it turns towards nous becomes soul. And presumably there would be something like this from maybe soul to perception, and now from perception um, uh, to physis, to growth, and now then to growth to um, matter itself, to the last matter. And of course, the difference of the last matter is that it's what doesn't turn, right? It's so purely indeterminate that it no longer has any capacity to turn to its cause, and so it doesn't become another principle. And so that's what he's um, saying here. So that he's, in a way, he's justifying this because you might say, well, the say, okay, you plant a seed and a tree grows, with water and sun and nutrients and time. And you might think at first, okay, what this nutritive soul is responsible for is something quite concrete. It's what it produces is things is plant bodies, at least, or organic bodies. But here he's saying no, it actually produces matter itself. Maybe producing matter is also is like a secondary activity on its part. I'm not sure, but he's given a further a further step. So like besides making it the Nutrusol producing plants and plants and shrubs and things and grass, it also somehow is responsible for matter itself.
Matter does, I mean, these bodies of plants or of animals and stuff are matter that has form.
Exactly, exactly. They are matter that has form, so that's why I'm saying that this seems to be like a further step down.
Okay, so but we say that matter is cannot, like, doesn't turn towards its source or something, is just as matter itself. I mean, matter is the point of it is that it can get form, just not sure, like.
Yeah, yeah. The point of it is that it can get formed, so it can still be formed by something else, but it itself doesn't form itself into anything.
Okay. Okay. I mean, sort of, just because then it would be a like logically necessary for, like we get into this whole prime matter thing, because otherwise the whole matter form analysis doesn't work, because it goes on
Right,
forever.
right,
And
yes.
then, like, no, I'm just, like, saying it's not fair to like blame matter for not doing anything, because we need something that doesn't do anything. Like, that was the whole idea.
Yeah, no, no, I don't think he's, well, I mean, in other texts, he seems to be blaming it, but in other texts, he talks about matter as evil, but uh, it's not, it's
He
not
says
our
it
subject
cannot be an image of the soul. Okay, no doubt, even in things of the nearer order, there was indetermination, but within a form, but within a form that were undetermined. So not purely indetermination, but like in indetermination within, still within some kind of definition. They were undetermined, not utterly, but only in contrast with their perfect state. Something like the indeterminate activity of one or something has the form of intellect, but not a perfected intellect, not a formed intellect, but it's still something.
now.
Um, at this extreme point, we have the utter lack of determination. It's nothing. Let it be raised to its highest degree, and it becomes body by taking such shape as serves its scope. Then it becomes the recipient of its author and sustainer. Its present in body is the only example of the boundaries of higher existence running into the boundary of the lower.
Right. So yeah, so the forms of bodies are, as it were, the very last. You could even say they're the very last incorporeal things, right? Because heat and color themselves uh, don't have size. They only have size when they are in bodies, right? And so they're, as it were, the very last of the highest things down here. Um, okay. So that was the first chapter, and there it's the point here was to emphasize that soul is responsible even for matter, right? And um, and this is because I was going to quote this now. This is in part to explain how the soul takes care of everything is in the cosmos, right?
Okay, so two. So of this soul, especially that we read, all soul has care for the soulless. This soul meaning like the last one, the soul of the body.
The, yeah, the last one, the vegetative one. Yeah.
Okay. Though the several souls thus care in their own degree and their way. The passage continues. Soul passes through the entire heavens in forms varying with the variety of place. So he explains the sensitive form, the reasoning form, even the vegetative form. Okay. And this means that in each place, so places are these like sensitive reasoning and so on. And this means that in each place, the phase of the soul, their dominant carries out its own end, while the rest, not present there, is idle.
Right. I mean, the place here, um, I mean, the sensitive form, reasoning form, vegetative form, that's the informs varying, right, with the variety of place. So this is the part where it seems to me that Plotinus might be toying, although in other examples he doesn't have this. In other treatises, it's not his theory, but he might be toying or referring to the idea of transmigration of soul even into plants, right?
Mhm.
And because it goes through everything and it becomes whatever is dominant in it, right? In elsewhere, building on the Timaeus, he has this theory that the earth is the nourisher and the creator of plants. But here he seems to be at least toying with this idea. And um, and I don't think that um, the place here is somehow metaphorical. I think it means the many places in the world.
Okay. Um, but the point is that soul, so like he's soul here means all kinds of soul in the same way. And the
Right.
vegetative soul and reasoning soul, they're all soul,
Hmm.
unspecified. And that's called soul. That's how Plato says soul passes through everything, varying in each place. So if there's some places have that, something like that.
Hmm.
Like
So, right. I mean, but
there's a
I
univocal
mean,
meaning for the soul here, where like he talks about soul doing all these things. Although someone can say, well, these are just different things that we call soul.
right. He, so soul here, I think, is a term for kind. Um, he's talking about soul as all souls, right? So there are souls in the heaven, there are souls in the earth, there are souls in human beings, there are souls in animals, there are souls in plants, there are souls everywhere, right? So you can say soul is everywhere. Like we say, mankind spread across the earth. Right? There are human beings everywhere.
Hmm.
Um, and reading this, it occurs to me that there's also um, this there's some kind also of Stoic resonance here. I mean, I think it's just an echo, but like the Stoics had this thing about how you there's one active principle in the whole world, but when it's in the air, it's called Hera, and when it's in this element, it's called this other god, and so on. And there it's more that there's one single thing, there's this one body, this mass that changes and controls everything in the world. Whereas here, I think it's not necessarily he's not uniting all souls into one agent. Although Plotinus is fuzzier about that. Plotinus is fuzzier about the individuality of souls than later Neoplatonists will be. Um, but I think here we don't need any strong idea of the unity of souls. We can just take it as a count, as a type, right? So there are
Okay.
souls everywhere.
And soul meaning
And
something like something that does movement or that is responsible for change.
right, right, that changes itself, and you say no, but and you raise the objection. Someone might say, oh, right, but there are, it's just different things. What makes a plant grow and makes a dog bark and makes a man think, and makes a star move. And what he's saying here is, well, actually, all of them have have all these capacities, but in each case, there's only one capacity that's dominant, and that's why we see that thing doing that thing. That's why trees don't fly and dogs don't do philosophy.
Hmm.
And not when we're looking anyway. And the and this is partially also, as we saw, that was in the Timaeus. There was this idea that the part of in plants is also in us, but also like with regard to human beings and the stars and the world and also the other animals in the Timaeus, they all have the same structure. They also have the circle of the same and a circle of the different. The question is just that when we're born here, the circles aren't perfect. They get all squeezed and contorted, and we have to, through education, um, put them right again. But in the Timaeus, there's basically this idea that there's one structure of soul for all the different kinds of animals.
Hmm. Okay. Sort of theoretically, we could have been able to fly, just since we use up our soul too much for doing other things, then we're stuck here.
Right. Or, I mean, if you think about how birds come to be in at the end of the Timaeus, right? It's people who, if I remember correctly, they invest too much in astronomy. They're obsessed with looking at the stars and not in understanding their motions. And and so the thing is, so that our ability to look up and to think about the sky, that is the origin of flight, right? And actually, flight is some kind of poor imitation for true astronomy, for astronomy that goes beyond sense perception and becomes a mathematical science and upwards to philosophy. So all these different kinds of animals, they're actually images of the moral and intellectual capacities that we have. Right. So,
Okay.
and or also, like the bees and the ants, they're an image of our social virtues, our political virtues. So this is, as it were, giving a cosmological physical function for the ladder of virtues.
Okay. Where are we? Um, okay, now in humanity, the lower is not supreme. The lower, like the animal, vegetable soul. It is an accompaniment. But neither does the better rule unfailingly. The lower element also has a footing. And man, therefore, lives in part under sensation, for he has the organs of sensation. And this is like already a thing, right? Because like some living things just don't have those organs and therefore are dominated by some other part, like vegetables, I guess, who don't have sensation and so on. And in large part, even by the merely vegetative principle, for the body grows and propagates. All the graded phases are in a calibration, but the entire form man takes rank by the dominant, and when the life principle leaves the body, it is what it is, what it most intensely lived.
Um,
Well,
y-
that's
yeah,
weird.
what it most intensely lived. Yeah, I'm looking at the um, it. Yeah, that's a colorful. In the Greek, it's just what was most in it, right? Well, what it was most. In the other translation they did, it becomes that which predominated in it. But so here we have, he connects this um, idea to the soul becoming uh, to transmigration. And here again, the idea seems to me that you transmigrate into plants as well. You become whatever is most dominant in you. And um, right? And you can already wait. Um, was that clear?
Yeah. So, but no, I'm saying so. There's like two things. There's the like nature of a human that has all of these parts, and it doesn't entirely have a dominant part, or it does. I mean, we do say that humans are rational animals, but not all humans are actually rational animals, or don't behave that way sometimes. So turn out not to be, and then actually become into non-rational animals by transmigration and things like that.
Right. So the dominant thing in a human being is reason and like in the nature of a human being, but it has the other things, and therefore sometimes it uses, it lives an irrational life. It uses more one of the irrational powers, and then it gets reborn as something where that's the dominant thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, and then like if you go to a and like if you get reborn um as an animal, or let's say let's countenance, if you get reborn as a tree, then of course you won't actually have organs to do reason. And then there's like a puzzle about like how do you escape that, right? Because it seems that you can't then live a better life if you can't exercise that. Um, there's there are a couple of ways to think about this. One is that you can be, one way is to imagine the soul of these things as not entirely tied to them, as it were. They're in some sense, as it were, spirits trapped inside. And then you can think that maybe they're thinking all the time and they can therefore learn with the experiences, right? You can just they're just there, they're just suffering things. They can't exercise reason by talking or anything, but they can still learn from their experiences as a plant or a donkey, and therefore they can in the next life choose something better. The other thing would be to think in like the moments that they have to learn are just in the moments in between lives. Um, and you can also think, well, maybe in these cases there are still images. Okay, they can't do reason, they can't talk, but they do have other opportunities to exercise that. So, for instance, a wolf could fast, right? It could fast and not eat meat, right? This will kill the wolf, but it would be doing by acting like a vegetarian. It would, in that sense, indicate its rationality. Or also, there are many traces of rationality in what animals do, from being pets to building a great number of things, and they have their own technologies of building homes and nests and so on, and making music. And so all these things could be ways for them to engage in rational activity or in some kind of imitation of rational activity, so that in the next life they're reborn as a human being and so on. Um, so, um, so yeah, but in every case, the soul always has all these capacities, but it just doesn't always have the organs to exercise them.
Okay. That goes together with like seeing this soul as this like thing, like a kind of thing, and somehow is not so different. Like,
I mean, uh, I mean, it depends what you mean by a kind of thing. I mean, it's right if you mean it's not, it's depersonalized, right? So it's not connected with us. But it's not the thing in the sense that we can know what a soul is through sense perception, right? I mean, sure, we recognize that things move themselves, but for us to understand what a soul is, we can, in some sense, only do that from the first person, right? We only know what this life is because we have it within us, producing thoughts and so on. So you can say it's a thing in the sense that it's not an individual person, it's not a biography, but it's not a thing. But if it is, it's a spiritual thing still. It's not out there, right? It's inside.
Hmm. Yeah, but like something like uh okay, Aristotle like seems to think that transmigration is just a proof that the soul can't be that kind of thing because transmigration doesn't make sense, and like criticizes it for saying that the soul of a kind of body has to be a kind of soul or is to be more connected to the kind of thing that it does than Plato would have it. And some like thing like complains that Plato has nothing to connect the soul of a person to its body because it seems, and Plato agrees because it can be a soul of a wolf. So, and like there seems to be a difference in like what to what extent there's a kind of thing called a soul or something like something responsible for change, like in just like that, or maybe the kind of change that we call life even.
I
And then
presume, I mean, later, there's explicit discussion of this criticism of Aristotle, that says, it's absurd that there should be, that such different things should have the same form. Doesn't make sense. Um, and so then Proclus develops this theory that actually every animal has two souls. There's the immanent soul and the transcendent soul, the rational soul and the form of the body, and he says they're distinct. Here, of course, we don't have something so scholastic, but I guess this idea of the predominator, what predominates, is supposed to answer that in part. Yes, it's the same structure, it's the same soul in all things, but in each case, something different predominates. Right?
yeah, but the sameness is like important.
Hmm?
The same, it predominates, but like on maybe like only in something like in an active way, like it's more active, but like as a theoretically or like potentially they still have all the power. Like there's some like something like people like to say like energy, I don't know, like some capacity for self-changing change, which then is just differentiated by where you are or maybe by somehow he doesn't say how they become predominated, like how.
No, but I mean, we can think like given the examples, maybe the idea is so you have all these capacities, but then which which are used as instruments for which? Do you use your reason in order to hunt better, or do you feed yourself in order so that you can study? Right? And so one of these will be predominant in the sense that it's the end and the others become instruments. So that's like one step we can give to what predominate means.
Okay. But like what causes it to be naturally so? Like why are you or I mean in some sense this is weird because like okay because we discussed about choice. Like on on the one hand he's like calling things that are not like what we know as choice. Like animals some sort of chose to be animals, like in whatever the myth says, but in some sense. And in the other sense, or maybe that's the same sense, like the things that we call natural are not so natural. Like what I'm trying to get at is we have this different like we have these different life forms like humans, animals, maybe plants, and maybe gods and all of things like that. And usually tend to think of these as sort of natural differences, right? Like it's just like the order of the universe that you're a plant and you're a god and you didn't choose it. Now Plato sort of collapses these things. He says, well, the god sort of chose to be a god in the sort of the same way as the plant chose to be a plant, although both of these things are not choice, or in our sense.
Right. So you're right that this is in a sense this undoes as it were a strong nature culture opposition or nature artifice. This is also a move that Plato does in the Laws. In the Laws, there's also the argument about how soul is as self-mover is the cause of all change, and he concludes therefore that actually what we call what we should call Nate, like he does two things. One is he says, well, then the things of soul, so the arts and laws and so on, they are more basic than the natural things, the elements. And then he does another step where he says, well, actually, if we call nature the oldest thing, we should actually call this stuff laws and customs and arts and virtue. We should call that nature. Um, and but anyway, yeah, it is a it does in that sense, this is not a hard divide anymore. And in that sense, there's actually, this is a hot topic nowadays because when people are studying uh, the cosmology of peoples who live in the Amazon. Right? So they have this thing, for instance, that each kind of living being sees itself as humans. So the jaguars amongst themselves, they see them as human beings. But then they see the other things, which we, for instance, we see as blood, they see as veer, right? We see them as jaguars, but they see themselves as human beings, and they don't see us as human beings. They see us as something else, right? So this is also another that's, of course, Plato doesn't go down to this level, but you see that this is another example of bringing down this distinction between nature and culture, right? Um, or rather, one way that people have explained this Amerindian view is to say there's one culture. So for all the animals, there's distinction between who's a hunter, who's hunted, what's poisonous, and there are all these same categories. But the nature, so to speak, so like the bodies, they're different for each person. So like what we see as blood, they see as beer. And so and that that's actually not in Plato. Plato doesn't develop anything that extensive, but it goes well with Plato, and so there are many harmonies here. So that to one thing, yeah, he is saying that the things we think are natural are not natural in the
Right.
sense
Or
that they're
another way of
grounded.
saying it,
Yeah,
like it can make the difference with collapse the difference between sort of like virtue, like things that have moral worth and things that have just like we would like something like this is sort of the goal of every like ancient good moral or almost all of them would try to like merge like have either natural laws or have some kind of even just reward and punishment, which is saying like you thought that this guy being rich and you being poor is because just because he has more money. No, it's because he's better than you. And then we get into questions. Well, it doesn't always seem that way. Well, okay, maybe in a previous life or something. Like we can have, um, but like the fact that you're a human and he's a lion is also because you're better than him. Assuming it's better to be a human or whatever. But
right.
and like,
So yeah,
but
so
that
like
also goes the other way and then ruins what we call like moral choices and says, well, those are not as strictly like your fault as you thought before because they're also sort of like they have the sort of the same meaning as these, and then they're not as different, not as special, maybe.
um, well, yeah, so you're right. I mean, it does contribute to somehow like this moralization of the world. And it is, I mean, yeah, so in like the Platonic text seems clear that it's better to be a human being than to be a lion. Um, and so the idea would be, yeah, so the fact that you're a human being, that person is a lie, and that soul is a lion, it's because you made a better choice in the past. Doesn't mean you're making better choices now, right? And so and um, and that's and in the laws, this is explicitly connected with providence, right? It's this there's this image of the god playing this game, moving the souls on like a checkerboard, and then like the better soul he moves up, and then the worse soul he moves down, so that everyone is always in its appropriate place and things like that. And um, but on the other hand, as you mentioned, there's also this question that then um, hmm, you said that in some sense, then our choices are relativized.
I mean, if you make maybe something like this, if you make Uh, I mean, if the things we thought are just like natural luck, right? And people talk about like moral luck, like how is it if you need to be smart to have certain kinds of virtue, then how is it fear that some people are born with less intelligence or something? And then that turns out to be your fault in some sense. Um, well, then the things that are literally my fault turn out to be somewhat less of my fault because we sort of ruined the word my fault, whatever that means.
Ah,
Or because like well, the kinds of choices that I make now, or the kind of, like we said, the kind of life that is dominant in me, um, is also somewhat maybe result of a previous choice. Okay, but then it goes on forever.
I mean, the
Something like if you can, hmm, not sure, maybe just like,
well, but there's a distinction between my choice and the result of my choice. And sure, so like the fact that I was born into such a family or into that family, and therefore I have this advantage or that advantage, or this disadvantage, that disadvantage, that will now in some sense be because of some kind of thing that we're calling a choice in between lives. But that so the Platonic texts are quite clear that these choices of life don't negate the choices during lives. So as he says, the God is blameless, right? The God is blameless. So you have to um, think that even though you chose, for instance, the life of a tyrant, it's still in principle possible to live that life well. It will be very difficult, but it is still in principle possible. I mean, you can think of this as also as a benefit, right? As a feature. It's not a bug, it's a feature of the theory because the theory makes us far more, in sense, understanding that, all choices are in a sense made under constraint of previous choices. There is no completely free choice here because we're always constrained by previous choices. But one other thing that can help to make this a bit easier to understand is also to emphasize that we have to think better what this activity between lives really is. So using choice there is some kind of a metaphor. And also who makes it, right? If it's not the biographical element in us, right? Who is this that makes us? And that then connects with the idea that if if the immortal part in us is the rational soul, then maybe, and it's then ultimately responsible for the choice in between lives, maybe it's not actually us, right? Maybe it's better to think of it as, again, some kind of daimon, some kind of spirit that we have some special relationship to, which we have to figure out. That we have the opportunity to identify ourselves with or not. Something else that can help us think, I think, in these situations is to think about when we dream. Like, to what degree are we free when we dream, right? Do we have, because very often in dreams, we find ourselves doing things that we couldn't imagine ourselves doing, right? And furthermore, we have the experience that we imagine things, and then it has to be coming from us in some sense. We imagine things that we wouldn't want, right? And that we wouldn't choose. Um, so uh, yeah, I don't know what to draw from the thought from the dreaming analogy, but it does give us another situation where our talk about choice seems poor. Seems not to capture what's going on. Um, that's
no, but no, okay,
so
maybe I've just finished. Right. Like the imagination, like I was thinking of is something like, or maybe this is not like, I don't know if Plato has like this kind of level of talking about transmigration, solving wrongs or something like. like we have these stories like I don't know, maybe someone was a thief and stole from people, and then the question is, uh, how is it fair for the victims? Okay, I made a bad choice, but like the people that were stolen from just got stolen from, and the answer is, well, in the previous life, the thing was it was the other way around. You were the thief, and he was the victim, and now it's just being justice for that. And then that seems to like just be the same problem on both sides.
Yeah.
Like,
The
okay, so am I when was the like bad choice if both of them are, I mean, okay, when did it start? I don't know, but
yeah, so this so to answer the Plato question, on the face of it, seems no, Plato doesn't have that. The point of the transmigration is just, as it were, for moral education of each one, right? And it's so, um, but I mean, in the sense that it's not about, as it were, punishing the other. Like oh, I stole, and therefore now someone steals from me. No, it's not that kind of thing. It's like I stole, so now I'm born with as a human being who, from the get-go, has this tendency towards stealing, or maybe I stole so much and I was so greedy that I became an animal that's super greedy. Um, so I don't see this kind of retribution, although that does exist in some Greek texts, and I mean this then gets tied up with questions about the late wrath of the gods, right? I mentioned this a bit in the when we're discussing Homer. So it's like, how can a curse fall on grandchildren and great grandchildren? Plutarch and Proclus have texts about this, and Plato sometimes mentions the idea. But yeah, that's a different issue. But I mean, I think all the issues that you're picking up are real issues for these theories. So,
um, okay, where are we? Okay, so the point is now that we have, yeah, it all goes back to this like question of like this existential, right? Like the if we're choosing like something like the existentialists are busy with, like, do you choose to be you, and does that even make sense, or does it go the other way around? And first you're something, and then you choose, but then how does that make you into something? And so on.
right. It seems that the for the Neoplatonists, it's not as extreme as the existentialists because there is still they do have a psychology. They do have a theory of the soul. There is some essence here, right? And because there's that essence, there's the hierarchy. There's the idea, for instance, that it is better to be a human being than a lion.
Right. And
So
and
it's
and and but that essence is somewhat less like what he calls here the dominant part. Like you can choose, or there can be just like there can be different life forms who are all alive, just different, like a human being is more rational, an animal is more sensitive. Uh People can sort of choose that also. And you
right.
should
And
choose. And there's also a should in that. You should choose the right one.
there's there's this tension, of course, because of course each person should choose the right one, but for cosmological purposes, we need all the different kinds of things.
Okay. Um
Um,
that's why God created
so
the existentialists, so they should. Yeah. Um
um, so yeah, why don't you read the next
Yeah,
paragraph?
this is why we must break. That's where I am. Yeah. This is why we must break towards the high. We dare not keep ourselves set towards the sensuous principle, following the images of sense, or towards the merely vegetative, intent upon the gratifications of eating and procreation. So, okay. Our life must be pointed towards the intellective, towards the intellectual principle, towards God.
Right. So this we must break away towards the high. That's a quote that's the that Theaetetus quotation that he started on virtue with, right? We have to flee this world. Um, and so he's giving more context, right? So all of on virtue was to answer this question, how do we flee this world? We flee this world by becoming virtuous. What's that? How do we become virtuous? And here he's saying, why must we um, escape this world? Because we become what we are, right? We become what we attach ourselves to. So ideally, we have to um, be pointed towards the intellective, towards the intellectual principle, towards God.
Hmm.
So um, there, he talked to it about this turning towards nous. More in the sense there, the question was, um, in some sense, you can say was right more philosophical or more moral, because there it was just about why should you do that? Well, because the life that's separate from the senses is a better life, right? It's happier. It achieves its goals more.
Yeah,
It's not tied. It doesn't get into these conflicts that
exactly.
sensuous
Exactly.
desires get into. It's more simple. Um, but but now he's brought another view. Why should we turn towards the higher things? It's because we become what we turn towards. And so if we turn towards nous and we turn towards God, we're going to become nous and God. Um, and and so we have time for one more chapter. I mean, one more paragraph.
You hear me?
Hi. Yeah.
Yeah,
No.
okay. Sorry. So these ferocious animals where the sensuality is become from some spirit, so like right, the thumos, gluttonous and lascivious animals where all has been appetite and satiation of appetite. Those who in their pleasures have not even lived by sensation, but have gone their way in torpid grossness. Not sure what that is. Becomes mere growing things for I don't know who's someone that doesn't even have sensation. For only or mainly the vegetative principle is active in them. And such men have been busy betraying themselves. Okay. That's those we read that otherwise untainted have loved song become vocal animals. Kings ruling unreasonably but with no other vice are eagles, futile and flighty visionaries ever soaring skyward become high flying. Birds, observance of civic and secular virtue makes man again, make them become a man again. Or where the merit of is less marked, one of the animals of communal tendency, a bee or the like. Okay.
Right. So here he goes through all the different kinds of things, and indeed, here he clearly says that he means that you can transmigrate and become a tree. And yeah, so torpid grossness, that must be um, torpid in the sense of being without sense. Um, and well, let me just um, right, Nothea Aesthesios. So yeah. Um,
He's thinking of someone that
uh,
sort of doesn't even care what his food tastes like, just eating or something.
yeah. Someone who just eats, or maybe someone who, for since reproduction is common with plants, it's also someone who cares too much about sex, I imagine.
Yeah, but without
Um,
sense in some sense, like without
right. Someone
uh,
who also, is just is not interested in the physical sensation and the perception of sex. I mean, who's just doing it to reproduce themselves.
mm.
Um, that would be
Oh,
someone
I see the
who.
people that are just having a bunch of babies with IVF. Okay.
Well, right, yeah. like that. Yeah, yeah. Those creepy guys that are just spreading their semen around the world. Yeah. Uh, so yeah, so here he goes through all of them, and he says, okay, this person becomes that, this person becomes that, but this is all set up for where we'll continue next time, which is that he then starts the next chapter saying, well, then who becomes a spirit and who becomes a god, right? And that's how he then starts to explain what the spirit is, right? By talking about who becomes a spirit.
Mhm. Okay.
Um, Okay, so
Yeah.
this was fun. Next week is fine for me. Fine for you?
I hope so. Let me check 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah, should be fine. The week after we won't. It's Pesach on the
Okay.
13th, that
I'll
is.
send you the bill
22nd
for this
also
month.
not, I guess. Yeah, so next week, yes. The 2 weeks after that, I guess not. Um,
Okay,
yeah, send me, I think. Okay.
sure. Great. Have a good one.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.